Look at any rainbow, any depiction of a rainbow, the one on a children's poster, the one on a flag, the one in a textbook diagram explaining the visible spectrum. Count the colors: red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet. 7. Always 7. Roy G. Biv, the mnemonic drilled into every schoolchild's brain so thoroughly that the 7 colors of the rainbow feel as fixed and factual as the number of continents or the days of the week. 7 colors, settled, eternal, beyond question. Except it wasn't always 7. And the deeper I went into the history of how we divided light into colors, the more I found that the number 7 wasn't observed. It was chosen by a specific person at a specific moment for reasons that had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with something much older and much stranger than the physics of refracted light. Isaac Newton, the man who split white light through a prism and described what came out the other side. The experiment is famous. The result is taught in every physics class on Earth. Newton directed a beam of sunlight through a glass prism and observed the spectrum of colors that emerged. He described what he saw. And what he described was not 7 colors. Newton's initial observations, recorded in his own notebooks, describe 5 colors: red, yellow, green, blue, violet. 5. A continuous gradient of color that he divided somewhat arbitrarily into 5 major bands. This is consistent with what you actually see when you look at a spectrum. The rainbow is not a series of discrete stripes. It's a seamless gradient. Dividing it into bands requires a decision about where one color ends and another begins. And Newton initially made that decision with 5 divisions. Then he changed his mind. He added orange between red and yellow. He added indigo between blue and violet. 5 became 7. And 7 is the number that was published. 7 is the number that entered the textbooks. 7 is the number that every human being alive today learns as if it were a property of light itself rather than a decision made by one man in the late 1600s. This raises a simple but critical question. Why 7? The official explanation is well documented because Newton himself was quite explicit about his reasoning, and his reasoning had nothing to do with physics. Newton wanted 7 colors because he believed in a deep structural harmony between light, sound, and the cosmos. He was drawing an analogy between the colors of the spectrum and the notes of the musical scale. 7 notes. 7 colors. The universe, Newton believed, was built on harmonies that repeated across different domains. Light and sound were different expressions of the same underlying mathematical order. 7 was the number that maintained the analogy. 5 didn't work. 8 didn't work. 7 was the number that made the cosmos sing. Newton wasn't just a physicist. He was an alchemist, a theologian, a man who spent more of his life studying biblical prophecy and alchemical transmutation than he spent studying optics and gravity. His published physics represents a fraction of his intellectual life. The rest, the alchemy, the theology, the numerology, the mystical investigations that occupied decades of his work, was deliberately suppressed after his death by executors who understood that the father of modern physics couldn't also be known as a practicing alchemist without undermining the entire project of scientific rationalism that his physics was being used to support. The silence was deafening when I started tracing Newton's actual reasoning for the 7-color spectrum. Because the reasoning is documented. It's in his notebooks. It's in his correspondence. It's in the historical record for anyone who looks. And it's mystical, not scientific. Mystical. The man who gave us the 7-color rainbow did so for the same reasons that medieval scholars organized knowledge into 7 liberal arts, for the same reasons that ancient traditions recognized 7 planets, 7 chakras, 7 days of creation. 7 wasn't an observation. It was a sacred number imposed on an optical phenomenon that doesn't naturally divide into 7. As if they were following instructions they didn't fully understand. Now here's where the thread gets strange. Because before Newton fixed the spectrum at 7, other traditions divided the rainbow differently, and one of those traditions, persistent across multiple cultures, divided it into 8. Go look at pre-Newtonian descriptions of the rainbow. Pull up Aristotle's account, which describes 3 colors, sometimes 4. Pull up Robert Grosseteste's 13th century work on light, which describes a spectrum without fixing a specific number. Pull up the descriptions from Chinese, Indian, and Islamic optical traditions. The number of colors recognized in the rainbow varied across cultures and centuries. There was no consensus. The rainbow was understood as a continuous phenomenon that different cultures divided differently according to their own frameworks. But in several traditions, particularly in ancient Indian and Greek color theory, an 8th color appears, a color that doesn't map neatly onto the modern spectrum, a color that sits at the boundary of visibility, at the edge where light dissolves into something the eye can almost but not quite perceive. The ancient Greeks called it quaneos, a color that scholars have debated for centuries, a dark, luminous blue-black that isn't quite blue and isn't quite violet and isn't any color that the modern 7-band spectrum recognizes. The Sanskrit tradition describes a similar boundary color, a shade at the edge of perception that appears in descriptions of the rainbow and of divine light. The deeper I went, the more I found that this 8th color wasn't a fixed hue. It was a threshold, a perceptual boundary between visible light and whatever lies beyond it. The ancient traditions that recognized it weren't describing a wavelength in the modern sense. They were describing an experience, the experience of seeing color reach its limit, of perceiving the edge of perception itself, the moment where seeing becomes not seeing, where light becomes darkness, not through the absence of light, but through the excess of it. And here's what modern neuroscience has to say about this, because the science is fascinating and almost never connected to the color history. The human eye can distinguish approximately 10 million colors. The visible spectrum is a continuous gradient of wavelengths from roughly 380 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Within this gradient, the eye perceives smooth transitions, not discrete bands. The 7-color model isn't wrong in the sense that those colors don't exist in the spectrum. It's wrong in the sense that they're no more real than any other arbitrary division of a continuous phenomenon. You could divide the spectrum into 5 colors, or 8, or 12, or 100, and each division would be equally valid, which is to say, equally arbitrary. But the 8-color traditions weren't just adding a color to the visible spectrum. They were pointing at something the 7-color model specifically excludes: the boundary, the edge, the liminal space where color meets its own disappearance. Newton's 7-color spectrum has hard endpoints: red at one end, violet at the other, beyond red, infrared, beyond violet, ultraviolet, invisible. The spectrum, as Newton defined it, has walls. It starts and it stops. And the 8th color, in the traditions that recognized it, was the wall itself. Not a color within the spectrum, but a color of the spectrum's limit. The experience of reaching the edge of what the eye can perceive and sensing that there's more beyond it. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across every domain where I've investigated the deletion of a natural count. 13 months reduced to 12. 13 zodiac signs reduced to 12. 13 hours reduced to 12. And here, 8 colors reduced to 7. Each reduction removes a boundary, a threshold, a liminal element. The 13th month was the transitional month. The 13th zodiac sign was the healer between death and rebirth. The 13th hour was the threshold between day cycles, and the 8th color was the perceptual threshold between visible and invisible. Each deletion removes the element that connected the system to something beyond itself. The 13th month connected the calendar to the lunar cycle. The 13th sign connected the zodiac to the actual sky. The 13th hour connected the clock to the body's transitional rhythms. and the eighth color connected human vision to its own limit, to the awareness that perception has an edge and that the edge itself is a place of significance. If this is making you see things differently, if these questions are landing somewhere that matters, I'd ask you to consider subscribing to this channel. Not because I need the numbers, because the deeper we go, the more these threads connect, and the threads ahead are the ones that tie everything together. Subscribing means you won't miss what comes next. Here's where Newton's mystical reasoning becomes more revealing than his scientific legacy. Because Newton didn't just impose 7 colors on the spectrum, he imposed a specific kind of 7, a closed 7, a 7 that maps onto a musical octave, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti. 7 notes within the octave, 7 colors within the spectrum. But the musical octave has an 8th note, the octave itself, the note that completes the cycle by returning to the beginning at a higher frequency. Do to do. The 8th note isn't a new note, it's the first note repeated, it's the completion, the return, the boundary that tells you the cycle is whole. Newton mapped 7 colors onto 7 notes but deliberately excluded the octave, the 8th note, the completion. He took a system that naturally cycles, that returns to its beginning, that closes on itself in a loop, and he cut it open. He made it linear, a spectrum with a beginning and an end rather than a cycle with a return. Red to violet, start to finish. A line, not a circle, but light isn't a line. The visible spectrum wraps. Red bleeds into violet through the purples and magentas that don't appear in the rainbow at all because they're not spectral colors. They're combinations of wavelengths from both ends of the spectrum perceived simultaneously. Your brain creates purple by combining the reddest and the most violet light, closing the loop that Newton's linear spectrum broke open. The color wheel, which every artist uses, is round. It completes the cycle. It returns red to violet through the non-spectral purples. It includes, structurally, the 8th position, the return, the completion, the boundary where the end meets the beginning. Newton's 7-color line removed the return. It broke the cycle into a sequence. It imposed a linear, hierarchical, bounded structure on a phenomenon that is experientially cyclical. And the 8th color, the completion color, the boundary color, the color that ancient traditions placed at the threshold of perception, was the casualty. The deeper I went, the more the deletion of the 8th color started to look like the same operation I've found in every other system, the removal of the element that connects a measured system to the natural phenomenon it claims to describe. The calendar without the lunar month, the clock without the transitional hour, the zodiac without the threshold constellation, the spectrum without the boundary color. Each removal cuts the system loose from its natural anchor. Each removal makes the system self-contained, institutional, manageable. And each removal costs the user something that the institution doesn't value. The felt sense of connection to the phenomenon, the liminal awareness, the threshold experience, the 8th color. Here's what I keep coming back to: the perceptual question. Because the ancient traditions that recognized an 8th color weren't wrong about human vision. They were describing something that neuroscience can now partially explain. The human visual system doesn't just register wavelengths, it processes boundaries. It's particularly sensitive to transitions, to edges, to the places where one thing becomes another. This is why optical illusions work. This is why your eye is drawn to contrast. This is why the edge of a shadow is more visually interesting than the shadow itself. The visual system is a boundary detection machine, and the boundary of the visible spectrum, the place where color dissolves into frequencies the eye can't process, is a boundary, a real, perceptible boundary. Not a color in the wavelength sense, a color in the experiential sense, the experience of reaching the limit of seeing, the awareness of the edge. Newton's 7-color model acknowledges no edge. It has endpoints, but it doesn't acknowledge the experience of reaching them. It treats the spectrum as data, wavelengths to be sorted into categories, not as an experience to be felt, with edges that can be perceived and that carry their own information. The 8-color traditions treated the rainbow as an experience that included the experience of its own boundary. Newton's model removed that inclusion. And every physics class since has taught students that the rainbow contains 7 colors without mentioning that the number was chosen by a mystical alchemist for reasons that had nothing to do with observation and everything to do with an analogy to the musical scale. I'm not telling you the rainbow has 8 colors. The rainbow has an infinite number of colors. It's a continuous gradient. Any division into discrete bands is a human imposition on a natural continuum. I'm asking why the specific division we were given was chosen by a man whose reasoning was mystical, not scientific. I'm asking why the number 7 was maintained for 3 centuries without correction when the continuous nature of the spectrum was understood from the beginning. I'm asking why Newton's mystical numerology was accepted as physics, while the older traditions that recognized 8 divisions were dismissed as primitive. I'm asking what the 8th color was, not as a wavelength, as an experience, as a perceptual phenomenon, as the sensation of reaching the edge of what the eye can see and knowing, feeling, sensing that there's more beyond it. I'm asking what we lost when the boundary was removed from the spectrum and the rainbow was reduced from a cycle to a line. If you've come this far, you're not a casual viewer. You're someone who asks the questions that most people scroll past, and there's more ahead, more threads, more connections, more things hiding in the spaces between what we were taught and what's actually there. Subscribe so you don't miss what comes next, because once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. Go outside after the next rain. Find a rainbow. Look at it, not at the individual colors, at the edges, at the place where the violet fades into the sky, at the threshold between color and not color, at the boundary that Newton's 7-color model says doesn't exist. Your eye can see it. Your eye has always been able to see it. The edge of the rainbow, the place where light meets its own limit, the color that isn't a color, the 8th band that every ancient tradition recognized and that one alchemist in 1 century, for reasons that had nothing to do with light, decided to erase, handed a 7-color spectrum and told it was complete.